And Western media is only reporting on the war in Ukraine and Russia without any historical context. Can you explain to the people at home maybe what forces such as NATO and the US have been playing historically in this area? And are we experiencing the decline of Western dominance?
It's hard to say that there's a decline. And for context, one has to actually go back over a decade. Now, you see, when the major world financial crisis took place, you remember in Wall Street, the banks were in a flutter. Bear Stearns was in a flutter. AIG, the big investment company, went bankrupt and so on. The United States government came in and pumped a lot of money into the financial markets. Well, the group of 20 countries at the time, with France and others really, in the lead, approached countries like India and China and said, listen, you are carrying current account surpluses. Would you put some capital into the international banking system? And if you do that and quote unquote save capitalism, you'll get greater seats at the IMF board, and we'll disband the G7 and make the G20 essentially into the executive of world affairs. So China and India pump money into the international banking system, and the United States government also opened the floodgates from the Federal Reserve, and to some extent they stabilized capitalism. Now, in Beijing, serious discussion broke out about what the IMF called the satanic embrace between the United States and China. China was producing goods for the international market, was lending US consumers money because US real wages had been stagnant for most people. And then those wages, because they were not capable of buying these Chinese goods, people took the credit that the Chinese were lending to buy the goods from China. That's what the IMF called a satanic embrace. Now, if there was such fragility in the United States economy, the US economy, in Beijing, there was a serious discussion. We have to do something different. We can't rely anymore on the United States. At this point, the Chinese developed several projects. One was a kind of social transfer payment scheme, which ended up with the ending or the emancipation for most people in China from absolute poverty. That was the social transfer payment scheme. But secondly, the Chinese started to experiment with new markets in Central Asia, new markets in Southeast Asia, and so on. And this eventually, after Xi Jinping becomes the head of the government in 2013, is called One Belt, One Road, and then Belt and Road. Now, interestingly, the Chinese began to take the Belt and Road beyond Central Asia, through Iran, through Turkey, into Europe. 17 European countries joined the Belt and Road Initiative in this last decade. That's a lot of people, in Europe, finding that the Chinese were more willing to invest capital in European projects than the United States. So from Europe, there was a view that an integration with China was taking place. That's on the one flank. Secondly, because as a consequence of the catastrophic US wars, war against Iraq, the sanctions war against Iran, war against Libya, and so on, many of the sources of European energy began to go offline. And Europe began to essentially depend more and more on Russian energy exports. Hence, Nord Stream 2 becomes so important. There's also energy being imported from Norway into Europe through the Euro pipelines and so on. But the reliance on Russia begins to increase. So what you begin to see as a consequence of the financial crisis and then of these catastrophic wars is a kind of inevitable integration of Europe and Asia. This is the great historical integration of the Eurasian landmass that has not taken place, let's say for millennia. The last time probably was when the Mongols rode into Eastern Europe, but that was a whole other story. This is a historical process of integration. What it meant was that Europe was getting, in a sense, tied into a new set of arrangements with Asia and no longer so closely allied with the United States or North America. It's at this point that the United States enters actually during the Obama administration, but then Trump, both come into the story here saying, look, Europe, you got to make a decision. Are you an Atlantic power or are you an Asian power? Are you getting sucked into authoritarianism of Asia? That's the way they framed it. And so the aggression against Russia and China was really about who gets to dominate Europe. And Europe is such a strange continent, Chris, because at no point did Europe say, well, we want to have our own independent foreign policy, make our own decisions. They were like, we don't want to be caught under the hammer of the Chinese and the Russians. We're scared of them. But, we are okay with being under the hammer of the United States. But our independence is not on the table. The only person actually in recent period who has tried to articulate some independence, interestingly, and this may have to do with the heritage of Gaullism in France, is Emmanuel Macron. From all of Macron's great failures, and there are many, he nonetheless was interested. He wrote a book about this in 2016 in integrating with Russia, with having better relations with China and so on. There is a kind of historical integration taking place. And the United States, as a principal actor here, has tried to either prevent this integration, to delay it, or to stop it with force. And Ukraine became a battleground for this. So for people who look at the conflict in Ukraine as, say, a land grab by the Russians and so on, you're actually missing a much greater story. You could still look at it in the narrow way and say, look, the question of Ukraine and before that Georgia has a lot to do with the kind of what I would say is the unfinished collapse of the USSR. That's a process that didn't actually take place in 91. Everything was supposedly so easy in 91, right? USSR collapses. Now Ukraine is independent. Georgia is independent. Armenia, Azerbaijan independent. In fact, of course, we know that in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, these conflicts, that are an inheritance of the collapse of the USSR continue. So you could see other storylines as well. But the big picture here is about the historical integration of Eurasia and the United States' attempt to block it. Well, it's up to Europe to define its own identity. And I must say, for those observers looking at Europe from afar, it's hard to see what Europe's identity is. Look, Europe in the last, at least decade has been convulsed, brought into a convulsion by the United Kingdom around the whole Brexit debate. That called into question the identity of Europe. What is Europe? Is Europe the European Union? Is Europe NATO? Look, NATO is a Trojan horse of US power in Europe. NATO is not a European institution, even though it has secretary generals who are European, Jens Stoltenberg and others. It's an institution that's dominated and controlled by the United States. That should be without question. It's kind of silly to have heads of government of Europe talking about NATO as their institution. It's a silly way to operate. It's not a European institution. In fact, Europe doesn't have a combined military force, and that's a point of some great, distress for some European countries, that they don't actually have their own regional, let's say, military defense strategy. They've been entirely dependent on the United States since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then, of course, earlier, since the formation of NATO in the 1940s. The 1949 creation of NATO is the creation of Western Europe, at least as a security creature of the United States. There are US bases quite routinely in Germany, at Ramstein base and so on. Nobody questions the existence of a US base on sovereign German soil. It's taken for granted. It's a weird thing to imagine that you have a foreign base in your country. Why don't you have your own military bases? Why do you have a foreign government have a military base where they have extraterritorial power and so on? Yeah. So in that sense, Europe hasn't actually defined its own position. So I don't feel the ability, Chris, to talk about like Europe's identity in the world because, well, I'm interested to hear from the Europeans. And the other day I heard the European Union's leading diplomat talk about Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. Well, if that's Europe's self-image, that's terrifying, that Europe continues to persist with a false racist image.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, what I would say to Europeans is come to terms with a very simple prospect. The simple prospect is you are part of the Eurasian landmass. You are not separate from it, and you're not better than the rest of it. You have to engage with it. It's a curiosity that, say, the governments of Europe say Russia is authoritarian. Maybe it is, I don't know, but they say Russia is authoritarian and therefore we won't deal with Russia. But meanwhile, they deal with Saudi Arabia, which is self-described as an authoritarian state. Saudi Arabia describes itself as a monarchy, which if you look up in the encyclopedia under authoritarianism, monarchies are inherently authoritarian. But yet Europe has no problem talking to the Saudis. Now, you can have a debate about whether Russia is authoritarian or not. You can have that debate. But if you're talking to the Saudis, why don't you talk to the Russians? Strikes me as a kind of juvenile attitude by diplomats that they would make these kind of statements about a part of their own continent. The idea of Europe separating from Asia is an idea. In fact, Europe and Asia are part of one continent. There is a kind of natural flow. There is no real break. It's not an island that lives by itself. There is this kind of anxiety about the political systems in Russia or in China. Let's take them, because that is actually at the heart of why Europe says, well, we don't want to integrate with Russia or China. They are authoritarian. Let's come to that for a minute. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it was the West, particularly the United States, that went to Russia and, under the aegis of their ally Boris Yeltsin, they designed the system that we have now in Russia. They designed the system, in the late 1990s. By all indications, the Communist Party won a democratic election in Russia. It was stolen from the communists and delivered back to Boris Yeltsin. That was all under the watch directly of the Clinton administration. So people complain about the political system in Russia, the oligarchs and so on. This is the system you created after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you need to take some responsibility for it. I'm not a great defender of the Russian system. I had a great sense of expectation with the Soviet Union, with the Russian Revolution and so on. But I'm not a great defender of the Russian system. It's a system, which has oligarchs and all of these people. But that's a system the West created, put in place by their ally Boris Yeltsin. As soon as Mr. Putin tried to break from the West, he came to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. As soon as he came to break from the West, suddenly he became, the enemy. Before 2007, Mr. Putin was considered a great ally of the West. Thomas Friedman writes in a column, "We're rooting for Putin," he writes. This is before 2007. Tony Blair says, "I looked into his eyes and I see an honest man." George W. Bush says, "Putin is my buddy, my ally." I mean, suddenly when Putin said, "I don't want to walk alongside the United States at its beck and call. I don't want to be a subordinate ally of the US," suddenly he becomes authoritarian. That's interesting. And let me come back to before I come to China, come back to the question of Eurasian integration. You see, the European Union has produced a report where it talks about the inevitability of Eurasian integration. It says that this integration is going to happen, but Europe should be in charge of what's happening, not Asia, not China. And so they don't actually have a problem with the integration. What they have a problem with is that China, particularly, is an independent country which is not taking their orders. That's really the problem. So let's come to China now. Is China authoritarian? Well, it has a different structure, certainly, than US democracy. There are 95, 96 million members of the Communist Party of China, which is just having its 20th Congress and so on. They have a different system. Is it democratic? Well, for sure, it's not a caricature of authoritarian. And also, it's not quote-unquote democratic like the United States, where the electoral college essentially, defines who wins an election, where money has corrupted politics and so on. It's not like the US system is perfection. The Chinese are struggling to produce their own form of internal democratic structures. So you can go around saying, they're authoritarian. This is ridiculous. Angela Merkel was the Chancellor of Germany longer than Evo Morales was the president of Bolivia. And yet, when they couped Evo Morales in the presidency, they said he's been there so long. Nobody has a problem when Ms. Merkel was there for over 14, 15 years. I don't remember exactly how many years. That's not a problem. The problem is when an indigenous leader is the head of government in Bolivia. So if you look at all this, strikes me, there's a race angle to this, that we don't want to take orders from the Chinese. We don't want to take orders from the Russians, because they are Slavs or whatever. But Russia is a slightly different case. We don't want to take orders from the Chinese. That strikes me as fundamental. And we don't even want to make the attempt to understand what the actual political situation is in China. We're going to say, oh, look, in China, they jail all the dissidents. And who's sitting in Belmarsh prison? Belmarsh prison is not in Beijing. Belmarsh prison is in London. And who's sitting there but Julian Assange? You're jailing your dissidents. You jailed so many of them. Edward Snowden, not willing to come back to the United States, scared of being jailed. There are whistleblowers in the US who keep going to jail. We keep reading about this. But that is not put together in a report, and where people are then saying, well, it's an authoritarian society which is basically jailing dissidents. You see, so, I know there are levels of repression. The US is not a highly repressive society in terms of, like, all critics of the government are in prison. Of course not, but nor is China. Inside the Communist Party, there are enormous debates between the liberals and the hardcore Marxists and others. Most of the institutions in China are actually run by liberals, including the central bank and so on. They are liberals, many of them pro-American. There are different views in China. It's not a monochromatic society where what Xi Jinping says, everybody agrees. If that were a case, why are people so interested in who's going to be the next premier in China? Xi Jinping is going to be the head of the party and so on, but who will be the prime minister? Why is the interest? If it's all Xi's decree, then just see what Xi is saying. Don't read anything else.
China, at least, is openly authoritarian, while the US has this illusion of choice, an illusion of democracy, where people think they're free, but the systems are so similar because power invariably is corrupted at all levels.
Chris, just to elaborate on that, you see, I actually don't like the word authoritarian to describe anything, because it's, in fact, I think it's one of those terms which has become emptied of content. What does it mean to say a country is authoritarian? What does one mean? Are there levels of authoritarianism and so on? You see, in a country like China, there is a lot of grassroots democratic structure. There are neighborhood committees, all kinds of organizations. That's why when the pandemic broke out, neighborhood committees took care of people in the neighborhood. Everybody was tested by local medical structures and so on. They have a lot of organization in that society, far more than I was in the United States. I asked people, did anybody from the state or from some civil society group ring your doorbell during the pandemic to ask you how you were? No, nobody did. In that sense, it's a completely chaotic society, because there's not even like structures in your neighborhood, where people came to see some elderly people. Are you okay? Do you need anything? And so on. There are no structures. There is only the state. In that sense, if you were strict about the terminology, the United States is authoritarian. There's only the state. People wait for the state to deliver aid. But in countries like Cuba and China and so on, there's an enormous number of grassroots organizations. In Cuba, the committees to defend the revolution, most Cubans belong to some structure, Federation of Cuban Women, etc. And those structures participate in society. They enrich society. In that sense, they're not authoritarian societies, because people don't wait around for the state to act. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
If you define it like that.
I do not want to throw shade on socialist China, because I love what they do as far as executing aristocrats and stuff like that, where they go the opposite direction with this stuff. Okay, so American media just touted that the cutoff of U.S. semiconductor exports, as if we make a lot of semiconductors in the first place. Does America even make any significant amount of chips? And what's the real story here?
The chips are made in many different countries, including in the part of China called Taiwan. I mean, how does one even talk about Taiwan these days, well, Taiwan, a lot of chips made in Taiwan, some made in the United States, Germany and other places. There's a kind of chip war that the United States government has entered into, which I think is going to hurt everybody, frankly. Here's an irony. In the 1990s, the US government was a champion of globalizing world economy, building global economic structures, commodity chains, decentralizing production, and so on. And the Chinese eventually go along with it and join the World Trade Organization, open up large areas of China for business like Shenzhen and so on. Today, the opposite is happening. The Chinese want to have a globalized open economy, and the US is creating barriers. You see, earlier the barriers were for economic development. The countries placed barriers like subsidy and tariff barriers so that they could develop their own economies. Now the barriers are entirely political. They are not about economics. Where the US says, we're going to stop China selling phones to other parts of the world. Let's spend a minute on this. What are these political things the US is doing? Because underneath the politics are also economics. Why is the United States so angry with Huawei, for instance? Well, interesting. When globalization took off in the 90s, Chinese were very clever, much more clever than the Indians and the other Indonesians and others. What the Chinese said was, you're a German company, you're welcome to come to, to Hubei province, Wuhan, where the pandemic was said to have emanated. Lots of German companies in that province. You're welcome to come to Hubei. You can set up your whatever it is, your sort of green technology firm which produces solar panels. Come and build it here. We have highly educated workers. They are well fed. They understand motivated people and so on. But you have to teach us what you're doing. You have to transfer science and you have to transfer technology. Otherwise, you can't come here. These companies, hungry to get well fed, highly educated Chinese workers, said, fine, here's the paper. This is what we're doing. This is the science behind our solar panel, and this is the tech. Take a look, but keep producing. Well, went great for these companies, 5 years, 8 years, and so on. And then down the road, a Chinese company opens called Solar Panels China Incorporated. And within like 5-8 years, the Chinese company is making better solar panels and cheaper. And China now is the world's largest producer of green technology. Same in robotics, same in telecommunications, same in high-speed rail. The Chinese are up there, if not as good as Western companies, maybe better. And it's a consequence of this, Chris, that Obama started the trade war, which then Trump intensifies. And Trump intensifies the trade war. Tim Cook of Apple Computers comes to see Trump. Now, you'd think that all these liberals from Silicon Valley, Tim Cook and others, would come to Trump and say, stop the trade war because all our computers, all our machinery is produced in China. This is going to hurt us. No, Tim Cook understood that this war was good for Apple. How? They were willing to take a short-term hit they would find it difficult to get, maybe they would even lose the ability to produce goods in China. They'd have to move to Malaysia or somewhere. They'd take a short-term hit, but they wanted to fatally damage Chinese telecommunication companies like Huawei because they can't tolerate the competition. You see, what has happened is China now is head-on-head competing with the United States in all these important fields, which are really motors for the US economy. Telecommunications, high-speed rail, robotics, green technology, everything I listed earlier. China is competing head-on-head. Huawei, you go to Africa, go to, say, Zambia, go try to buy a phone in the market. Nobody buys Apple phones. They're too expensive. They all buy Chinese phones or maybe South Korean phones. You can buy a Samsung much cheaper than you can buy Apple. But certainly Chinese infinitely cheaper. That's what people buy. They are not buying Apple. So, you see, part of the trade war against China is actually the existential crisis faced by US capital, these sectors in particular. They want to use US power, diplomatic, military power, to weaken these companies in China. That's what they are interested in doing. And so now it's gone crazy that the United States is saying we're going to essentially destroy the world chip producing economy in order for us to get an advantage. And therefore, Biden, who can't get enough money to rebuild infrastructure in the United States, has said the United States government is going to underwrite the construction of chip manufacturing in the US. There are some chip manufacturing plants already in the southwest of the United States, in Arizona and New Mexico and so on. But they say we're going to produce more. By the way, before this trade war intensified, it was in fact Huawei and others that were coming into the upper Midwestern states in the US to invest in chip manufacturing companies. It was not US firms that were going to do that. So this trade war, which is about the existential strength of companies like Microsoft, Apple, that's what the US government has gone to war on behalf of these companies. This trade war is going to destroy the world economy.
So what happened was America said, hey, world, do you want to play a game of Monopoly? I got the board here. Let's play. I'll teach you how to play. They teach China how to play. China becomes way better at it, starts winning. And then America just takes the board and shoves it off the table and goes, you know what? Fuck you guys.
One of your listeners, viewers wants to go and look at the CHIPS Act passed by the US Congress in July of 2022. It's interesting because it's a sign of desperation. It's this desperation that somehow the US government, which has not been in this business ever, is going to come in and is going to somehow incubate semiconductor chip manufacturing in the US. Let me ask you a question. Who's going to work in these factories? Who is going to work there? Well, they say we'll robotize the factory. Okay. Who's going to create and manage the robots? You have a serious skills shortage in the United States. You've been importing, people from all over the world in high-skilled areas of work. From which countries? From Eastern Europe, from Russia, from China, and so on. They are not going to come any longer. So where are these skills going to come from? If you take a farming family, 20 generations, they are farming corn, let's say. And then you take the land away from them and build a high-rise building. And then 3 or 4 generations later, you say, hey, listen, we're all hungry. Let's go back and build and grow corn again. Nobody remembers how to grow the corn. People are used to living in the building, eating at McDonald's. None of the generations that come later remember how to grow the corn. You don't have enough people here at the present moment in the United States to really execute the CHIPS Act. Unless you import more people or get migration opening. Ask the Republicans to open the doors to migration. Well, that's another contradiction.
So this is essentially what Jello Biafra was trying to warn us about when he said we adopted the mentality, give me convenience or give me death, to where now these modern conveniences have made us soft, useless, fat Americans. This is why I left that place.
I won't agree with you because that would be offensive for me to say that. But I will say that one of my favorite films from the United States is WALL-E, where people just sit in lilos and slurp drinks and sort of are sped around the galaxy and so on. So, you can say that. I could not possibly.
Yeah. I'll say it for you. Don't worry. So I'll ask you one last question, then I'm going to let you go because you're a busy guy. Obviously, Western governments, especially America, infamous for, staging coups and undermining people's democracies. We're very good at it. In your opinion, what were some of the most egregious or maybe some of the unknown examples of the U.S. meddling in other countries' affairs?
You know that after World War II, obviously the United States occupied Japan and was a party to the writing of the Japanese constitution and so on. And at the same time, because in the constitution, there's an article that says Japan no longer will have a real military and cannot deploy its military overseas, security for Japan was left now in the hands of the United States. After having dropped 2 atomic bombs and firebombing Tokyo, the US is now going to take care of you. Okay. As a consequence of that, large tracts of land on the Japanese mainland and in Okinawa Island were basically handed over to the United States. So the United States built a large base in Okinawa. Even now there's a project to expand the base and friends are trying to block that because the expansion of this base is going to render extinct the dugong, which is, like a manatee, which lives in this bay in Okinawa. Anyway, it is a terrible situation in Okinawa because, a very large part of the island is taken up by the US base. So there was a groundswell of opinion in Japan to have the US bases not expanded and perhaps some of them shut down. In 2009, Hatoyama won an election coming from a kind of, center-left political opinion. He was really a centrist, not even much of a leftist. But Hatoyama wins the election with a mandate to no longer allow US bases to expand and perhaps to roll them back. Well, very interesting. There was a coup against Hatoyama and he was removed from government. Now, why this is interesting is nobody knows about this, and it's not even called a coup because his party decided to remove him from the position he was in. Okay, let's look at the evidence. What happened? The US and Japan have a very uncomfortable but tight relationship with each other. Very uncomfortable but tight relationship. United States actually prefers it when Japan is ruled by the right wing, including these nationalistic, fascistic right wing like Shinzo Abe, who was killed this year in a very odd murder. But the right wing is actually preferable because the right wing, they don't mind US bases. They want to build up the Japanese military. They're aggressively anti-China and so on. But when Hatoyama came to power, he wanted a kind of conciliatory policy with his neighbors, and he wanted to roll back on the bases. But because of this very tight relationship between Japan and the United States, when President Obama when he came to Tokyo, he kind of came to Tokyo and then refused to come to the official banquet, snubbing Hatoyama in a sense and making him look really bad in Japan. And through a series of interesting maneuvers, a visit of Hillary Clinton, conversations with Japanese parliamentarians and so on, they created the conditions for Hatoyama to lose support in parliament and then be removed as prime minister. Now, once he was removed as prime minister, the entire agenda to roll back US bases in Japan, perhaps to stop construction or to, in fact, remove some of the bases, that entire agenda, political agenda, has been defeated. And it's no more in evidence. So, what is this but interference in a country's democratic decision-making? The Japanese people elected somebody to come in and roll back on the militarization policy. The US government intervenes to get rid of that person. It's very interesting. Vladimir Zelensky, similarly, elected with a peace mandate to negotiate with the Russians and so on. But that was simply not permitted by Washington, D.C. That peace agenda that Zelensky was elected upon could not be put into place. The United States consistently undermined that. The most unspoken part of this undermining was Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty, the treaty that is one of the centerpieces of the Arms Control Treaty. The US walked away from that treaty. Well, having walked away, Russians walked away and said that, we need a new security discussion. US said, we're not talking security with you. And then the Russians invade Ukraine. I mean, these are all unspoken parts of contemporary history. You ask anybody about what happened in Japan in 2009, even in Japan, and this is not understood in this way. What's understood is that Hatoyama comes to power, he becomes unpopular, and they withdraw support. But how this happened in Brazil, this is precisely what was done to Dilma Rousseff in 2016. She was removed in essentially what you might call legislation fair, a kind of warfare conducted through the legislature.
And I just ask you about Kirchner, too. Is this a similar event with Kirchner?
It's a little more complicated in Argentina because in Argentina, the coalition that's governing is a little fractious and doesn't have full agreement on the agenda to be pursued. It was, in a way, a coalition of very disparate elements. So Kirchner was part of a kind of left Peronism, very much uninterested in going back to the IMF, open to the idea of borrowing money from the People's Bank of China and so on. Alberto Fernandez is to her right. And he wanted very much to, quote unquote, return to international capital markets, going back to the IMF. So in Argentina, it was to some extent, Chris, an own goal. Now, it is also true that the finance minister of Argentina, Martin Guzman, who went and made the deal with the IMF, then quit his job in the government and went to work for a US funded agency. So I can't tell you more than what is factually known.
Right.
You can draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, and I will. So.